Hello, welcome to another episode of Analog Adventures. My name is Crispin Jeffrey Franco. I'm a co-founder of Stacks Book Club, and joining me today is author Allegra Goodman. We are talking about Allegra's brand new book, Isola, which is a Reese's Book Club pick for this month. It's also the Stacks Book Club Fic Trip pick for this month. You might be familiar with Allegra's work from her most recent novel, Sam, which was a Read with Jenna Book Club selection, and prior to that, The Chalk Artist, Intuition, The Cookbook Collector, Paradise Park, and Catterskill Falls, which was a National Book Award finalist. She's written two collections of stories, The Family Markowitz and Total Immersion, as well as a novel for young readers, The Other Side of the Island. Allegra's essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Book Review, the Wall Street Journal, the New Republic, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the American Scholar. Raised in Honolulu, Allegra studied English and philosophy at Harvard and received a PhD in English literature from Stanford. She currently lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Allegra, welcome to Analog Adventures. It's so great to have you. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we are so thrilled. So, like I said, there in the open, we have a subscription program at our store called Fic Trip. And I originally read a copy of Isola in like October or November of last year, and just like absolutely fell in love with it. We put it in the queue for our February selection, and so our subscribers got the book as we're recording last week, and hopefully have been devouring it. And so I'm just so excited to be talking with you and sharing a little bit more about this wonderful book.
Thank you.
So for those that aren't familiar with Isola, can you give our listeners what are they going to be looking to find out when they pick this book up?
So this is a novel based on the true story of a young French noblewoman in the 16th century who sails to the New World and ends up marooned on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. It's about her ordeal. It's about what she learns, how she survives, how she grows. It's an adventure story. It's a story about love. It's a story about faith. It's it's a story about what you believe and how you can keep believing when you're really being tested in every way, physically, emotionally, spiritually.
Yeah, I agree with all that 100%. I just love there's so much packed thematically into the book, which we're gonna get into here in a second, but there's just so much packed into this novel. It was really amazing. So this is your second novel that's been picked up by a major book club. Sam was a Read with Jenna pick, and now Isola is a Read with Reese's book club pick. What is it? What is it like? How does it change the publishing experience and the post-publishing experience when one of these national book clubs grabs onto your book?
It's kind of wild. The nice thing about these book clubs and these celebrities who do book clubs is, I mean, they don't have to do this, they have plenty of other things that they could spend their time on, but it's really amazing and very moving that they are readers and they want to share their love of books with their huge numbers of followers.
Yeah.
So they use their platform in this way for good, which is great for writers, for readers, for booksellers, for everybody.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, I mean, as a bookseller, when we start to get word from publishers that books are selected, that's usually an indicator for us too. There's gonna be a lot of spotlight on this book. So we were pleasantly surprised when we got word from the publisher here with the Dial Press, right? That Isola had been selected because we loved it so much. It wasn't a shock that Reese would have also loved it. So the question with Reese is always she chooses books for her book club and a lot of times ends up doing a project with those books. Is there anything in the works that you could talk about?
I have not heard anything, but the
Okay.
writer's always the last to know. So I'll let you know if anything happens.
Perfect. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, would you be willing to read the prologue for us?
Yes,
Um,
of course.
yeah,
Of
it's
course.
such a great introduction to the book. And if you listen to this prologue and you don't run out to your local independent bookstore and grab this book, I'm not sure what you're doing.
Thank you. All right, this is the prologue for my novel. Prologue. I still dream of birds. I watch them circle, dive into rough waves, and fly up to the sun. I call to them, but hear no answer. Alone, I stand on a stone island. I watch for ships and see three coming. tall ships close enough to hail. I load my musket and shoot into the air. I see pennants close enough to touch as I run barefoot to the shore. Rocks cut my feet, and I leave a rocks cut my feet, and I leave a trail of blood. Brambles tear my sleeves and score my arms as I shout, "Wait! Stop! Save me!" The ship's commander hears my voice and gun. Dressed in black, he stands on deck to see me beg. As I plead for help, he smiles. When I shoot, 10,000 birds rise screaming. Their wings beat against the wind. All the sailors hear and see, but their commander orders them to sail on. I reach, but cannot stop the ships. I wade after them into the sea. In vain I struggle as wet skirts drag me down. I cry out, but water fills my throat. I cannot fly. I cannot swim. I cannot escape my island.
Amazing, 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 amazing. That is such a great introduction to the book. Um, so I do want to talk about you. You mentioned that this is based on a true story,
Mhm.
and I read a little bit about how you came across that story, which is just like just the most happenstance parent of a story ever. Can you tell us how did you become aware of Marguerite, and then how does a story like this take shape?
Yes, yes. So, this story, I came across the story of Marguerite 22 years ago when I was traveling with my family. We took a road trip up from Boston, where we live, Cambridge, up to Montreal. And we drove all the way through Vermont up to Canada. And we had our four children with us, who were at the time, we had three boys. We have three boys and a girl. At the time, they were ages 10, 7, 3, and 0. So those were the three boys, and the our daughter was a newborn. She was just 6 weeks old. And I'm still not sure why I agreed to go on this trip
It's very
with a
adventurous. Yeah.
newborn and a toddler and these two older boys. But I think that looking back, I was in some kind of postpartum euphoria or something. So, I thought I could do anything. So as part of this euphoria, I went to my local public library and took out all the books for children about Canadian history, which was a whole stack of books, some for little kids and some for like medium-sized kids. And I brought them with us, thinking that I could read these books with the boys about early Canadian history, and we would have all these like teachable moments on our trip. So, surprise, surprise, as we drove through Vermont and we got to Canada, the boys had no interest in looking at these books about Canadian history, and they read zero of them. But I read all of them because I was up all night nursing the baby. And one night, as I think we were in a hotel in Montreal, I was sitting up in bed, nursing the baby, and I'm reading this book for sort of middle grade nonfiction book about the early exploration of Canada by Jacques Cartier, the great explorer from France. And this book was about Cartier's three voyages to what they called New France in those days, which of course is now Canada. And I was reading about the third voyage, the third and final voyage, which is in 1542. So this is almost 100 years before the Pilgrims come to Plymouth. And in this account of the voyage, there's this sort of parentheses in the middle of the paragraph, and it says, on this voyage, Cartier was accompanied or followed by a ship commanded by a nobleman named Roberval, who was bringing colonists to New France to spread Catholicism throughout the land. And Roberval had a young kinswoman on the ship named Marguerite de Roberval. And she annoyed him, and he set her down on an island in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and left her there. Close parentheses. And then the paragraph continued, like literally the paragraph continued, and Jacques Cartier went on to found this colony, and I was like, wait, what? Who is this woman? How is she why was she on the ship? How did she annoy the commander? Why was she set down on this island, marooned on this island? And how did she survive there, in this subarctic climate? And all these questions rush through my mind as I'm sitting there with this 6-week-old baby in my arms, and I'm thinking, wow, this would be such an interesting story for a novel. But then I thought immediately, wait, that's a historical novel. I write contemporary fiction. I can't do that. this idea stresses me out. So I put the idea aside and it germinated for a long time. But that was really how I came upon Marguerite's story for the first time.
It's like, yeah, it's so wild. It's like at first, like what made the writer of the story include that parenthesis, but
Yeah,
then B, once you put that in there, how is that all that you put in there?
I
Like, where
know.
is the rest of the
I
detail?
know.
It's
It's
such
sort
an
of like
interesting,
he caught himself digressing and then he
yeah,
closed the parentheses. I also love that it was these parentheses. It was sort of, I thought I think now very symbolic of sort of what happens to women's history. You know, this is a story about a great male explorer, and the woman's story is, right
right,
there in
yeah.
the
The women in history are relegated
cloistered.
to footnotes and sidebars, right? Like,
Exactly.
yeah. So
Yeah.
so you've got so then I think did you do more research beyond that to find more about
Yeah.
Marguerite?
So I ended up writing a whole bunch of other books, some of which you've mentioned. And I got to the point, my kids grew, of course, time passed, they grew older. I no longer had a newborn. I was sleeping through the night. It was great. Um, and it got to the point where I was writing Sam, which was pretty recently published in 2023. And I was writing Sam um while my daughter was finishing high school. So our youngest child was about to go off to college. And Sam is a young girl in the 21st century who lives on the North Shore of Massachusetts, and she's a climber. She climbs these boulders. And I kept writing about, how she was climbing up these rock faces and figuring out what to do. And she's really a striver and she's trying to survive. And of course, she has very different challenges from a young woman growing up in the 16th century, but challenges nevertheless. And she's very much tested. And I think it was the physicality of Sam's experience that got me thinking about the young woman on her rocky island who was also trying to climb and trying to survive. And I started secretly reading more and more about whatever I could about Marguerite and about her world. And then my daughter went off to college, and I was finally an empty nester and had more time. So while I was writing Sam, I started to experiment to see if I could possibly write a historical novel. And so I would write Sam in the morning. I would be working, I was far along in that project and I was, working on my computer. And then by hand in the afternoon, I would try out different openings for this novel. I thought if I could just write the first sentence, maybe it is possible for me to write this book. I'd done a lot of reading by this time, and I was starting to think, what would she sound like if she was telling her story? And I knew I wanted to tell it in the first person because I wanted it to be like a female Robinson Crusoe. And Robinson Crusoe tells his story famously in the
Mhm.
first person. And so I started writing the first sentence until over and over for days and for weeks until I got to a sentence. I got to a point in my notebook where I wrote something that went like this. I never knew my mother. She died the night that I was born, and so we passed each other in the dark. And when I wrote those words, I thought, "Oh, there she is.
Yeah, it's
I can
real
hear
now.
her. She's telling me the story now." And I kind of knew that I could do it once I had that handhold, to use a climbing metaphor.
Nice. That's amazing. So, I mean, it's got to feel pretty amazing to be able to take a woman from history that was sidelined by her era and by her time and by her gender, and then in the history books, and actually provide her with a voice and with agency and to build this whole story from her. How do you go about filling in the truths of her life with the book and facts that you were able to find? What does that process look
Yeah,
like?
so you can do a lot of research if you're a historical novelist, but with somebody like this, there isn't a huge amount that's known. So you also have some challenges. There's a lot of space to work with. Or you could say it's a challenge or it's an opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity there. So she was relatively famous in her lifetime, and there were two contemporary accounts of her ordeal. And I read both of them, but they were each only about a page and a half to 2 pages long, and they conflicted with each other. So I really had a lot of chance to decide to sort of choose my own adventure or choose her adventure and figure out, how I wanted to tell her story, which was really a lot of fun.
That's awesome. How strict are you when you're so this is your first historical fiction novel, but as you're thinking of the genre of the era that she lived in, like how true to the timeline are you? Are you willing to take some creative license in terms of things that may not be totally anachristic. Is that the right way to say that word?
I know what you
Um,
mean.
to the time, or do you try to stick
I
pretty
try to
true to?
avoid anachronisms. I One thing I really tried to do is to sort of work with work in the voice and in the character of a person who is obviously like us in some ways, and that she suffers and she loves and she is disillusioned and she goes through some of the things that we go through, but is also from a different culture and a different world from ours. And that difference interests me. I didn't want to write a novel in which sort of the material culture was accurate. The ship was right and the clothing was right and that kind of thing was right. But then when you get into her thoughts, she sounds like a 21st century feminist because she was a 16th century woman who grew up in a very particular time and place, and she had a certain education, and I wanted to honor that.
Yeah, I think that comes across throughout the novel. The Marguerite, obviously, from start to finish, is a different person by the end of the novel, and rightfully
Yes.
so, given what she experiences through the course of her life. But she lives in the same time,
Yes.
and she's still bound by the structure and the conformity and the requirements of the time that she lives in. So I did appreciate that she felt like she was a piece of that time
Yep.
period, and not like what you said, yeah, a modern character trapped in a time that doesn't make sense for her. Like I feel like she very much is a part of her time.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this book, you touch on some of the themes in the intro. I mean, I picked up, there's loss, there's resilience, there's self-determination. But I think the one that pushed me the most was this idea of faith, and how far
Mm,
faith can be pushed or tested before somebody is willing to either consider or break from that faith.
mhm.
What types of emotions and feelings are you hoping that readers who pick up Isola come away from? What kind of questions are you hoping that they ask themselves after reading and meeting with their book clubs? Like, where do you want those conversations to go?
Thank you. I think that yeah, her she has a crisis of faith when she undergoes this ordeal. And she is a Catholic person who comes from France, and she's been raised by a very devoutly religious nurse who who really has a strong faith, and she has a strong religious education, which is what young ladies got in those days. So her framework is very religious. She's been taught that if you sin you go to hell. She's been taught, certain she's also been taught that sort of God has a plan, and she's been taught that if you doubt that, that is a flaw in your character. So this is sort of the groundwork for her. This is the framework that she comes to the island with. And when she gets there, she really begins to wonder what the plan could be for her, and that in if she's going to survive, and she enters a life and death struggle. And I was really interested in writing about that. In all of my work, I'm very interested in what people believe and what they don't believe. I'm interested in doubt and the stories we tell ourselves, and also resilience, where you might come through a crisis and then what might happen to you. So I explored all of those things, and I think if people are discussing the book, they might be interested to see the progression that she goes through after she suffers some loss, how she responds in different ways, and how she grows. Watching her grow, I think, was the most interesting part for me of that book. And really she's forged into a new person by this experience. She perceives things differently when she comes, I don't want to spoil things too much, but she sees the world differently after this. And all of that really fascinated me, thinking about what she might believe, even, and how she might confront her doubts and admit her doubts, especially when she's alone and she doesn't have her teachers around her or the doctrine that she grew up with near her.
Mhm. Yeah, without spoiling too much, there's a really beautiful line towards the end of the book where she's reflecting to herself, and she thinks about, you know, some scripture that she was given to read at the time that it was given to her was felt like a punishment. But then through the study of that material, it became a salvation at some point, and just kind of seeing how she evolved in her faith from the start of the book to the middle of the book and then to the end of the book. It's a beautiful arc in terms of what faith can do and what it can mean different points of your life. And so I hope that readers that are out there and are choosing this book for book clubs, like there is so much to talk about in this book. Like you can't go wrong by doing it, which is why we chose it and why Reese chose it and why book clubs around the country, I'm sure around the world, would choose it. But we can't talk about this book, Allegra, without talking about. I'll hold it up here for those that are on the video feed. It is one of the more stunning covers, and even without the
Mm.
cover, the design of the book, the green and the gold, it feels very evocative of a time period and like a regency. What was
Mhm.
your role in crafting the
Oh,
physical
well, I
details
wish
of
I
the
could
book?
take credit, but I mean, they had some beautiful, wonderful designers who came up with this visual for the book, and I've heard from readers how much they love the cover, and I love it too. I just feel so lucky that these, writing a book is a solitary act, but publication is a team effort. And I got to work with some amazing people, including the art director and the book designer. And I can tell you that um, when I first saw the image for the cover with this ocean and this rocky cliff and this woman, I just felt like they captured what Marguerite was up against. It's a beautiful image, but it's also kind of haunting, and you can see the challenge that she's going to have and her isolation as she stands there high up above this turbulent ocean. And it's just dramatic and it's wonderful. So I couldn't be happier. I should also add that my editor had the idea of the font for the title, which she asked the designer to base that on the old font of from the map that is
Oh, that's
reproduced in the
amazing.
first pages of the book. So it's not like a modern font. It's very elegant and readable, but it's this older, like 16th century lettering, which I think is so elegant.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's beautiful. In Southwest Hispanic culture, we have a I don't know what the right way to phrase it. We have a woman called La Llorona, which is the
Uh-huh.
wailing woman, which is a woman that grieves uh, children
Mm.
that have drowned, and she's a lot of times used by parents to kind of scare kids into behaving. Uh, I heard lots of stories of La Llorona when I was a kid, and if I didn't behave, she was going to come for me. And that's sort of like what the cover evokes for me. Like there's
Mm.
this solitary woman that looks like she's experienced grief, and she's standing on the precipice of this gigantic cliff, and there's danger, and there's solitary, and there's isolation, and it looks terrifyingly cold, and like all of that ends up inside the novel. So kudos to the art team. Kudos to you for such a beautiful book. um, I'm really excited for folks to get out there and read this book. What do you have going on next? What's the next project, if you're working on something
Oh
and able to talk
yeah.
about it?
I believe it or not, I have an next project and it's sort of in production. It's like in copy editing
Wow.
because I had written another book at the same time or overlapping with this one. And that one's a contemporary book about a family, Jewish family in America. And it's and pieces of that, and it's something I've been working on for a long time, and pieces of that book have been published in the New Yorker in over the years. And it's a multi-generational family portrait with the grandparents, their grown children, and then the grandchildren. So it's these three generations, and the different pieces of this portrait, you can see the family from different points of view, the older generation and the younger. And it's set in like 2015 to 2017. So very contemporary compared to
Nice.
this book. Different kind of a different style, a different voice, but very much a book about faith and family and the stories that we tell ourselves, the self-deceptions we undergo, what we do for each other, what we do to each other in families. It's funny, it's sad, it's poignant. So I'm excited about that. 2026.
2026, count me in. I love a good multi-generational, yeah, the scars that we leave from generation to generation, and
Yes,
how we
yes.
try to heal those, how we don't heal them all. Like those stories always get me. So count me in.
Yay.
Allegra, we like to end the show by asking our guests, what's the last great thing you've read?
Oh, well, I read a few things at once. But actually currently I'm reading this book, like literally it's right here next to me. It's called Wednesday's Child, and it's stories by a wonderful writer named Gi-Yun Lee.
Nice.
Um, and it is she's an exquisite writer of stories, and I love short stories. And she is a Chinese writer who has lived in America for many years now, and she writes about family and loss and grief and love. And it's a beautiful book. I recommend it. It's in paperback right now. I think it
Perfect.
was a Pulitzer. Yes, it was a Pulitzer Prize finalist, I think, last year or recently.
Nice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing that recommendation, for sharing your time with us today. You can pick up Isola at your local independent bookstore. It is available now. Run out, grab it, book it for your next book discussion with your club. And Allegra, thank you so much. We'll see you after your next book, hopefully.
Yay, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much for having me and for picking Isola.
Have a good one.
Thanks.